The last day of death row. Inmate, Louis Gaskin. The end of the ninja killer's reign. Hello, friends. Tonight, we turn our attention to one of the most chilling figures ever to walk Florida's death row, Louis Bernard Gaskin, the man who called himself the Ninja Killer. For more than 3 decades, he sat in a cell at Union Correctional Institution, haunted by the murders that shocked Palm Coast in the winter of 1989. Dressed in black, armed with a rifle, and driven by a twisted fantasy, Gaskin prowled the night looking for strangers to destroy. What followed was a spree so cold and calculated that even seasoned detectives were left shaken. His long path through the courts ended with an execution warrant signed after 33 years, sealing his fate at last. Tonight, we'll walk through his crimes, his bizarre confessions, his final hours, last meal, and strange final words. Stay with us until the end of this prison documentary, and don't forget to subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries. Louis Gaskin was born in March 1967, the youngest of 7 children in a household filled with instability. Like so many who end up behind bars, his early years were not marked by stability, but by neglect and anger. He grew up in Bunnell, Florida, a small town that offered few opportunities and even fewer second chances. At school, teachers described him as quiet and withdrawn, a boy who often seemed to be living in his own world. He never found his footing in academics or sports, drifting instead into isolation and dark fantasy. By the time he was a teenager, Louis was already brushing against trouble. Small thefts, skipping school, and an interest in violent images began to surface. To those around him, he was strange, but not necessarily dangerous. Yet inside his mind, something darker was forming an identity that would later emerge fully. He told others he was a ninja, someone meant to hunt, kill, and steal. This fantasy became the seed for a reality of horror. In November 1986, when Louis was just 19, he committed his first murder. He was working at a sawmill in Bunnell and had borrowed money from a coworker, Charles Miller. Instead of repaying his debt, Louis decided to take Miller's life. He went to Miller's trailer home, confronted him on the porch, and shot him. Miller pleaded for his life, but Louis pulled the trigger anyway. What was most chilling was what came after. Louis later confessed that he killed Miller because he believed Miller always carried cash. But that night, he found nothing of value. Miller's death brought Louis no money, only blood on his hands, and a case that would go cold for 3 years. At 19, Louis had crossed a line he would never return from, and he did it with no hesitation. For a few years, Miller's murder remained unsolved. Louis carried on with his life, but his need for violence only grew stronger. In the summer of 1989, he struck again. This time, it was not a co-worker or someone he knew. A woman making a night deposit at a bank in Daytona Beach was ambushed. Louis shot her, stole her company's deposit bag, and fled with $900. The woman survived, but the crime was left unsolved. Another cold case with no clear suspect. By December of that year, Louis's fantasies had grown to the point where he wanted more than money. He wanted to kill for the sake of killing. He dressed in all black, armed himself with a .22 caliber rifle, and set out into the night, telling himself that he was a ninja warrior on a mission. On December 20th, 1989, Louis drove to a quiet cul-de-sac in Palm Coast, Florida. He parked in the woods near the home of Robert and Georgette Sturmfels. Inside, the couple was relaxing in their living room, watching television. Louis circled their house like a predator, peering through windows. Then, from outside, he raised his rifle and shot Robert through the window. Robert clutched his chest in agony. Georgette rushed to his side, likely thinking her husband had suffered a heart attack. That's when Louis fired again, striking her too. He entered the home, chased Georgette as she tried to escape, and shot her multiple times. Both Robert and Georgette died that night, their quiet evening shattered by a stranger who killed for no reason beyond his own twisted fantasy. But Louis wasn't done. A few blocks away, Joseph and Nadine Rector were inside their home when they heard strange noises on their roof. Louis had thrown debris onto it, hoping to lure them into sight. When Nadine tried the phone, she discovered the line was dead. Louis had cut it. Moments later, he fired through the window, hitting Joseph in the chest. Miraculously, the couple managed to escape. They grabbed their keys, bolted out the door, and drove to a hospital as Lewis fired rounds at their fleeing car. Joseph survived his wounds, and both he and Nadine would later testify against Louis. Their survival became one of the most important pieces of the case against him. For nearly 10 days, the murders of the Sturmfels and the attempted murders of the Rectors went unsolved. Police had little to go on until Louis made a mistake. He gave stolen items from the Sturmfels' home to his girlfriend as Christmas presents. When his girlfriend's brother learned the truth that Louis had confessed to killing the couple and stealing their belongings, he made an anonymous call to police. Detectives obtained a search warrant and found the stolen property in his girlfriend's possession. On December 29, 1989, they surrounded Louis' home. To their surprise, he walked out calmly, almost as if he knew the game was up. On the way to the station, he made a chilling bargain: buy him a pack of black and mild cigars, and he'd confess everything. Detectives agreed, and Louis delivered. He described in detail the murders, the attempted murders, and even confessed to the unsolved killing of Charles Miller in 1986 and the bank robbery in Daytona Beach. He told them he was driven by the devil, that the devil had controlled him and told him to kill. He said being a ninja meant killing strangers, and he had obeyed. The evidence against Louis was overwhelming: his confessions, the stolen items, the surviving victims, and his own words to psychologists describing his violent fantasies. At trial, prosecutors painted him as a man who killed for pleasure, someone without conscience. His defense attempted to argue mental illness, pointing to his claims of being controlled by evil forces. But the jury was unmoved. In 1990, Louis Gaskin was sentenced to death for the murders of Robert and Georgette Sturmfels. He also received a life sentence for Charles Miller's murder. For the next 33 years, he would sit on death row, appealing his case but never finding relief. Louis Gaskin's final day came on April 12, 2023. He had spent more than half his life awaiting execution. That morning, he woke early, visited briefly with spiritual advisors, and ate his last meal, reportedly a simple combination of barbecue pork ribs, buffalo wings, pork and turkey neck, shrimp fried rice, French fries, and water. Unlike many others, he did not make a dramatic statement of remorse or anger in the hours leading up to his death. At 6 in the evening, he was led into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. Witnesses reported that he appeared calm, resigned to his fate. When asked if he had any last words, Louis spoke briefly, saying, "Justice is not about the crime. It's not about the criminal. It's about the law." He then referred to the legal proceedings and appeals in his case, finishing by saying, "Look at my case." Moments later, the lethal drugs were administered. At 15 minutes past 6 in the evening, he was pronounced dead. Dear friends, as we close the chapter on the life and death of Louis Bernard Gaskin, the so-called ninja killer, we are left with more than just the details of his crimes. His execution in April 2023 may have brought an official end to his story, but for the families of Robert and Georgette Sturmfels, the shadows of that December night in 1989 never truly lifted. For Joseph and Nadine Rector, who miraculously survived, the memory of those bullets and the fear that filled their home will never fade. Gaskin spent over 3 decades behind bars, a reminder that justice often moves slowly, but inevitably, it arrives. His strange confessions, his claims of being controlled by dark forces, and his final moments in the execution chamber leave behind chilling questions. What we know for certain is that lives were shattered, and Florida will always remember the terror of the ninja killer.